Welcome once again into the Radiopedia reading room, officially the world's most popular podcast devoted entirely to the art of clairvoyance. My name is Andrew Tea Leaves Dixon, and joining me, as always, master astrologer and tarot reader to the stars, it's my co-host, the great Francesco.
Oh, I like that. That's a title that definitely needs a cape to go with it, I think. I'll have to order it.
We may have just jumped the shark, I think, with that with that intro. People who are joining us for the first time will have no idea that this is actually a radiology podcast. Today's our second Hostful episode.
It is indeed.
So you've sent me a list of seemingly random segment titles that I haven't really been able to decipher. I'm going to go through them. Presumably most of them are just your pet goats.
Oh, yes. Lots of goats aplenty. Do you happen to know the collective term for goats?
No.
There's apparently quite a few. Some of them are boring, like herd or, flock of goats, which just sounds completely wrong. But the best one is tribe or trip of goats. So I think we should go for a tribe of goats episode.
All right, so we've got a tribe of Gaillard goats in this episode. I'll also throw in our usual Journal Club update, letters, our favourite segment, or what you up to. I've got a story about my recent trip to Sydney, if we need that as well. I can throw that in. And then a new segment about cognitive biases in radiology that I want to try out. So should we get into it?
Let's do it.
First one you have written here, Gaillard, it just simply says debacle. What does that mean?
Oh, my God. So before we get into it, I think I need to play you a clip from one of our earlier episodes. I think it was episode 2, where we were talking about presentations and how to give talks. So I'm just going to play you this clip now, okay? So one thing is, you don't want to be the guy that insists that they have to use their own laptop, because part of your responsibility as a speaker is to make sure the whole day works well. And that means fitting in with the organizers and fitting in with the time that's given to you. I don't insist on using my laptop. So no prizes for guessing that very recently I was that guy.
Yeah, you were the guy. What did you do?
This was at ANZ SNR, so the Australian New Zealand Society of Neuroradiology. They had their annual conference here in Victoria, and I was browbeaten into saying yes to giving a talk. In fact, I got you out of it because initially it was going to be a Radiopedia whole day workshop event that they wanted us to do. So I talked them down to just me showing some cases. And my idea for this was it was going to be, and it was on the first day of the conference, and it was going to be when there were a few people around, and it was going to be a small, intimate, almost like a tutorial where I wouldn't do too much preparation for it, and preferably with cocktails. And the whole thing, before I knew it, it ended up being a 3-hour workshop, just me doing cases. So I was essentially the whole session. And you know how we do our workshops, or we use Radiopedia playlists and we use a bunch of other stuff. So I had it all set up on my laptop. And I did all the correct things that I say you have to do as a speaker. I contacted the venue and I checked that using my own laptop would be okay. I checked that I was going to use my MacBook and that would be okay. I turned up early. I'd already found out what the aspect ratio of the projector was, all that sort of stuff. I turned up 45 minutes early, and it turned out that Mac is this very unusual, not well-known company, and the HDMI cable was, non-Mac compliant.
Mate, we've never heard of Mac.
Yeah, it's not like doctors use Apple products at all, right? So we spent 45 minutes trying all sorts of workarounds. So at the end, I ended up next to the AV guy at the back of the room, looking at the back of people's heads for all 3 hours, sitting sort of half twisted. Their lapel mic didn't work for the first half, so I needed to hold like a karaoke mic in one hand. And the thing that I found particularly difficult was, one, the way that I had thought about these cases and thought about the session was that it was going to be interactive. And you cannot do interaction when not being able to see people's faces. But the other thing that was really tough, when you're giving a talk, a lot of the energy that you bring to the talk comes from identifying a few people in the audience that are looking at you and are clearly engaged and clearly getting it. You don't look at the people that are on their phone or snoozing or looking bored. You look at the people that are engaged, and that reflects on you, and you can then, put more energy into the talk.
Yeah.
So I found the whole thing very, very tiring. And there was an intermission, and as I was getting a coffee and a Negroni, people were saying that actually it was quite good because I wasn't distracting them from the front of the room, which I'm not sure, that's a mixed blessing. But then we started up and sort of had a bit of a joke. And someone from the front audience said, I find it ironic that you are using your own laptop because in your podcast, episode 2, you specifically said.
They got you.
Yes, in public. And it was fair enough. I'm not doing that again, I don't think. I'd have to really have my arm twisted to say yes to this.
Even though sometimes the energy you're feeling is quite low, in my experience, people do really still enjoy those workshops. They just don't feel that they can necessarily speak up at the time. And they often do come to you in the breaks and go, oh, no, it's really good. I'm really enjoying it. And you're like, oh, I wish you'd just show some of that energy during the actual workshop. The thing I'm most amazed by is that you managed to bring an audio clip along to the podcast, Frank. It's almost as if you're like a real co-host.
Oh, don't get any illusions there. But I've actually, believe it or not, brought a second audio clip for you today.
Look at you. What a hero.
Do you remember we spoke about AI creating scripts and podcasts for us and that we wouldn't need to actually turn up anymore? I went off and I did a little bit.
It's on the list here, isn't it, somewhere? Which of these things on the list is it? Let me guess. Is it the is it the one called Handsome and Charming?
Yeah, that's the one. And it's not about you.
Before you play it, could we just explain for people? So this is you've basically written this with ChatGPT. You've got ChatGPT to write it, and then you place the text.
AI text-to-speech generator where you can give different voices. Yeah, here we go.
All right, let's you play it, mate.
Welcome to the Radiopedia Reading Room. I'm your host, Andrew, and I'm here with my co-host, Frank.
Sounds like me.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here.
So, Frank, I've got a meaty question for you today.
Meat?
Shoot, I love talking about meat.
If you were a cut of meat, what would you be?
Wow, Andrew, that's a tough one. I guess I'd have to say I'd be a prime rib.
Oh, fancy.
Well, you know me. I like to keep it classy.
Speaking of classy, have you tried the new meat-flavored cocktail?
No, I can't say I have.
Yeah, apparently it's called a Bloody Meaty Mary.
Man, that's a terrible joke.
Hey, I'm just trying to beef up our humor game.
I think I'll stick to my Negronis.
Well, there you have it, folks. Meat and Negronis, the keys to a successful life.
You got that right, Andrew.
So are we out of a job, Dixon?
I love that bit where AI Frank sighs. He's like, no, I can't say I have. That sounded just like you. The sigh.
Can you guess the prompt that I put in?
Well, obviously you said that you were handsome and charming. That really came through. Slightly sleazy as well. And that you like to drink Negronis, although it struggled with the plural of Negroni, didn't it? Unless I'm wrong. Maybe it is one Negroni and two Negronis.
Negronis.
You told it to chat about meat, obviously. Yep. And then for me, it sounded like, I don't know, lame jokes, likes to tell lame jokes or something.
Yeah, I told it that you liked dad jokes.
Sounds about right. Yeah, so do you think AI is closer to taking the jobs of podcast hosts or radiologists? Which are you more concerned about?
I find it fascinating that I suppose that this is true of every profession, but like radiologists are like really worried about radiologists' jobs being taken by AI. Mm-hmm. I was trying to think of an analogy for why I find this a strange way of worrying about the issue. And the best I can come up with is imagine you're at a cocktail party or something and you're speaking to a guy and during the party it's announced that an asteroid is heading towards Earth and it's not clear yet whether it's going to just miss Earth or it's going to hit the Earth. And this guy happens to be a beekeeper. And he says, oh, that asteroid thing, that's really worrying. It'll do terrible things to bees. And it's like, yeah, it would do terrible things to bees. But you know what? Along with the bees, everyone else is going to be super affected, right? And if it misses, well, the bees are fine along with everyone else. And I think radiologists' concern about the impact of AI is sort of similar in that if AI is going to occur so quickly and so profoundly that it genuinely means that radiologists are out of a job in the next 10 to 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
then radiologists being out of a job is probably the least of our problems, because enormous parts of society are going to have to change dramatically. And this isn't even talking about the, paperclip or grey goo scenarios of badly aligned, malevolent AI, just profound social change. And I am worried about the impact of AI globally to a degree. And I think radiology will be affected, but I think it's very unlikely that just radiology will be affected and everyone else will be fine. So I don't know. How do you feel about the whole AI risk versus radiology specific issue?
I think it's interesting the way things have changed in the last few years, because radiology was seen as an area that was going to be an obvious win for AI and maybe, something like self-driving cars. And then you realize that actually AI at the moment is really good for tasks where it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to mimic, kind of what a human would do. Whereas in radiology and self-drive cars, you actually need to mimic perfectly. So I actually see it as jobs at the moment where you're doing something where you don't actually have to be 100% precise. Those are the jobs that are more likely to be done by AI in the near future. Actually, our job, I think, is quite difficult for AI to do just because of that, degree of certainty.
From a legislative point of view, AI needs to outperform the best of humans. There's no way that a self-driving car algorithm that performs as badly as humans do would ever pass. I mean, in Australia, we still have about 1,000 roadside fatalities a year. If Tesla said, hey, our new self-driving car will only kill 1,000 people a year, there's no way that it would ever get across. And yet humans are allowed to drive. So the baseline that they need to achieve is far higher. And the same thing is true for radiology.
Now, I don't want to bring us back to talking about meat, but I kind of have to, because did you see that story during the week about the mammoth meatballs?
Oh, yes, of course. It's even Australian.
I thought you didn't listen to the news, but this one got to you.
I'm completely tuned into all meat-related news. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so for those who didn't see it, so there's an Australian company called, Vow, who used some DNA techniques to get some DNA from a mammoth.
Like a woolly mammoth, extinct.
Yeah, an extinct species. And then they combined it with some elephant DNA, I think, to fill in the missing blocks, just like Jurassic Park.
Yep.
Life will find a way. And then they've made meat out of it, lab-grown meat, like we were talking about in previous episodes. And then they've created this meatball and put it on display, I think, in the Netherlands or something.
So I think it's a really interesting area of research and change, and one that I support wholeheartedly, because I do think eating meat from animals is terrible. But the thing that's interesting about this is that creating meats that don't exist, like from animals that don't actually exist, means that you're also cutting the psychological relationship between meat coming from an animal that you can identify and see, and moving it more towards a sort of abstract idea of meat, which is probably a good thing. If we stop being used to killing animals to cut off their meat to eat it, it's easier to do if you can't even picture the animal. Although in this case, I can picture a woolly mammoth.
One interesting thing that I saw in the article about this is that they said that no one has actually tasted the meat. The protein hasn't existed for 10,000 years, and they can't confirm humans wouldn't be allergic to it or something like that. But that sounds like just them covering themselves. I'm sure plenty of the guys involved would have had a little taste of that mammoth meatball.
I think you wouldn't be able to resist, would you?
Yeah, I mean, the risk would be minuscule, wouldn't it? But the benefits, whew, I was the first person to eat woolly mammoth.
Oh, but imagine now there's a new strain of kuru coming from woolly mammoth experiment. This could be the plot of some bad sci-fi where zombies crave mammoth meat.
We should get back into some radiology themed discussion, I think.
Right.
So how about we do my new cognitive bias
Yes,
segment?
okay.
All right.
Sounds
So
interesting.
I'm sure most of you will be aware that there are a whole bunch of cognitive biases that can lead us astray as radiologists. And I was thinking of doing a whole podcast episode on this, but the more you dig into it, the more you realize there's a whole lot of them. So I thought I'd just choose one to chat about during this Hostful, and then if people enjoy it, we can maybe have it as a recurring segment and just slowly run through lots of different cognitive biases.
That sounds good.
I also thought I'd put you on the spot a bit, Gaillard.
Uh-huh.
Sorry, I should call you Francesco the Great. So I'll name the bias, and then I'll see if you can guess the definition.
Okay.
For the first one I've chosen, I used a scientific technique called going to the Radiopedia article and finding the first one that was listed, and it's in alphabetical order. So, so the cognitive bias that we're covering this episode is alliterative bias. What do you think that is?
Alliteration is where you match the first letter. So I haven't heard of that one. Is it like you're more likely to say that a colon mass is colorectal carcinoma because it alliterates rather than colorectal lymphoma? That sounds pretty weak.
Yeah, it's more likely to be multiple myeloma, malignant mesothelioma, choroplexus papilloma. No, it's not. It's not related to that form of alliteration. It's more related to the form of alliteration where you just keep repeating something you've previously heard.
That should be perseveration, shouldn't it?
It should be, shouldn't it? Yeah. So I'll read out the definition that we have on our website. So alliterative bias, sometimes called satisfaction of report, is the tendency for your diagnostic impression to be unduly influenced by the prior interpretation made by another radiologist or clinician. It's a type of confirmation bias, and it can result in the same incorrect impression being propagated from one radiologist to the next.
Mm-hmm. That definitely happens. I would have thought that was a anchoring bias. I don't know if that's been described in radiology specifically, but it's used for, like, let's say you go into a jewelry shop. Have you noticed how the first piece of jewelry that has a price on it is always the most expensive one that's right in the center, right? So you walk in and there's a $120,000 ring. And so you get that price in your head, and then everything else looks cheap compared to it because you've anchored that value. And there's lots of research showing on like jelly bean counting. If you have a jar of jelly beans, the one that I remember reading about is this big jar of jelly beans, and you have to guess how many jelly beans are in the jar. And next to it is a Wheel of Fortune sort of spinny wheel thing with random numbers written on it. And before you guess the jelly beans, you have to spin the Wheel of Fortune, which is clearly unrelated to how many beans there are. But the number that you spin on the Wheel of Fortune influences the number of beans that you guess. And so and that's where you know that it's unrelated.
Yeah.
And clearly when you've got a previous report that has a particular diagnosis or an impression, that gets really hard to unanchor from that.
One way to avoid the alliterative bias is to look at all the images, formulate your own impression first before you look maybe at the clinical history or at the previous reports. Our website makes a bit of distinction between alliterative and the anchoring bias. The anchoring bias is more you're anchoring to your very first opinion that you form.
Right.
Okay. So when you open the case and you see multiple enhancing lesions, you go, metastases, sweet, all right, and you go and you never reconsider the diagnosis because the first thing you thought of was metastases, rather than the alliterative bias, which is actually somebody else's opinion which is coming through. So I guess when you see the really expensive ring, that's the first thing you think of. You go, oh, these rings are really expensive, and then you see the cheaper ones and you go, oh, that's good value, that one there.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. Yeah. The other thing that I've noticed which I guess is part of this, maybe it's a separate bias, but it's creeping certainty across multiple reports. So you have the first report that says something like, features are non-specific, could be metastasis, could be meningioma. Meningioma is favored. The next one says, features are similar with meningioma favored over metastases. The third one is appearances are similar, consistent with a meningioma. And by the time you get to the fifth one, it's like known history of meningioma. And no one's ever actually biopsied or checked it. It's just over time, people fixate on one diagnosis, and the referrers do this too. That's probably a different bias. I'm not sure it's even a bias, just a thing, a phenomenon. Gaillard's phenomenon.
One thing I've noticed with cognitive biases is that it seems like you can just make up an infinite number of cognitive biases, and they all kind of overlap, and often it's the same bias, just in a slightly different context. So there must be a cognitive bias that we use that thinks that what we've uncovered is a new cognitive bias, when really it's just the same one rehashed. Anyway, well, we might come back to some more in the future, because I think they're a bit of fun to think about how you can maybe try and avoid them in your clinical practice.
Yeah.
All right, shall we move on to a bit of journal club, Gaillard?
Yes, all right.
I know you have one to chat about, but I wanted to quickly chat about a paper that you co-authored last month in Radiology, Artificial Intelligence. We're back to AI again. I only wanted to talk about it because I thought the result was a little bit contrary to what you kind of might expect. I mean, you were involved, so you'll know more about it. But the idea of this study was to look at how AI is presented to the user interface and how it's presented to the radiologists when they're reporting. I think they used lung nodules on chest X-ray. Some of the chest X-rays had lung nodules that were proven with CT. Other ones had no lung nodules and proven that they didn't have them with CT. And then the radiologist was looking at these blinded, and they did it without any AI assistance. Then they did it with AI assistance, and that came in a few different forms. One of them was simply just a text, which would say, I'm guessing something like, nodule in the right lower lobe is suspected. One of them had the text plus a confidence score, so 90% confidence that there's a nodule in the right lower zone. And the third level of AI assistance would have those two things plus an actual heat map to highlight where it thinks the nodule is. And interestingly, I think the radiologists preferred having the greater amount of assistance, but in terms of their actual performance, their performance was best only if they received the text input from the AI. So if it just said, I think there might be a nodule in the right lower zone, it was actually a statistically better performance from the radiologist. Is that right, Gaillard?
Yeah, so look, I was involved in this as the progenitor of the general idea, and then I took a back seat, and mostly because it was chest related, and I didn't really want to sit through reading lots of chest x-rays. But I think the idea of focusing on how we present information has been not explored as much as it should be. And the effect size of how you present the information that an AI generates, or any information, is really important. The same information presented in different ways can lead you to trust it or not trust it, and to sway you more or less. And I'm pretty sure that you could probably show an effect size by simply changing the font. If you showed the same certainty in Comic Sans, it probably has an effect compared to a trustworthy font like Arial or Helvetica. So the idea was to explore that. It's not a study without its limitations, but what it definitely shows is that how you present things has an effect.
And that we shouldn't necessarily default to showing the heat maps.
Also, we should make sure that when journals report on AIs, how they perform, that the way that it's presented to the end user should be shown explicitly so that it can be reproduced. Because otherwise you might find that there are significant differences with the same program, which are not actually due to the program, but due to the human's interpretation or use of it.
I think this is kind of like similar to that idea that you can't unsee something. When someone like a registrar might point something out and you didn't spot it, and then once they've pointed out, you kind of like, I can't really unsee that now. I don't think it's anything, but I can't not mention it. And that's probably what's happening, I think, with that. When you've got an AI that just says possibly a nodule in the right lower zone, you have a look, no, I can't see one, and you actually perform better in that situation than if it actually highlights an area. And then once it highlights it, you go, oh yeah, okay, maybe I can see that. Yeah, okay, all right, yep, okay, there's a nodule.
Yeah, that could be it.
There's a cognitive bias there, Gaillard, to explore. Maybe we can rename one.
It's hard to prove a negative, right? So if you've drawn something around it, how sure do you have to be before you confidently say it's not
Absolutely. there? Yeah, the can't unsee bias. And now, Frank, you've got an article that you brought along to Journal Club as well about the newly discovered fourth layer of the meninges.
Well, it's I think it hasn't been shown in humans yet. It's in rats or rodents, but I think it doesn't happen all the time that you get an entirely 33% more dural layers than before.
That could be the name of this episode.
So we're used to dura arachnoid, and pia as the three layers. There is a recent study by, now there's two letters here with symbols or accents that I don't know how to pronounce. So Molgard,
Yeah, Molgard the Great.
Molgard the Great, describe a fourth meningeal layer that is very thin. It's within the subarachnoid space, if you want, closely applied to the venous, to the external side. And it's been called the subarachnoid lymphatic-like membrane, or SLIME for short, SLYM.
I love it. And then in every picture in the article, they color it green to look like slime. So I love
perfect
that.
green colored slime. And it remains a little bit controversial. I think there have been criticism saying that it might not actually exist and it's artifactual. So I'm not sure how it will all play out. But if it's true, it sounds like it divides the subarachnoid space into a superficial and a deep compartment by a semi-permeable layer, this slime layer that only permits very small molecules through. And it's likely that it'll be yet another complicating factor in our evolving understanding of the glymphatic pathway, the pathway whereby fluid that exits the microcirculation in the brain and forms CSF then re-enters the brain via the perivascular spaces, and then somehow, and this remains controversial, ends up going back into the circulation, into venous end at some point, maybe. And in so doing, washes away semi-soluble extracellular proteins like amyloid precursor protein, and therefore disruption of the glymphatic pathway can lead to Alzheimer's and also chronic head trauma, encephalopathy, etc. And so when you look at the electron micrograph of this new slime layer, it's ridiculously thin. It's like a couple of cells thick, right?
Yeah.
And so you can imagine that repeated head trauma could cause repeated microtrauma to this layer, and that could have effects about how you clear these different proteins. You also wonder about the effect of a craniotomy on these physiological effects, or a subarachnoid hemorrhage, or all of these. So I thought it was interesting because we have this idea that anatomy is kind of fixed and that everything was worked out and described centuries ago, but you can find an extra layer of the meninges if you look hard enough. So well done, Molgard et al.
And perhaps yet another reason not to let a neurosurgeon get into your brain.
As if you needed more.
Let's move on to letters and questions. Should we do that? I've got a jingle. It's letters, it's questions. No. All right. Now, first one, this is from Cake Smoke on Podcast Addict, 5-star review. Like the other educational material, the Radiopedia podcast is exactly the right combination of entertainment and education. This is the only radiology podcast that is actually listenable in a car. Others that might have educational value, I simply find too boring in an audio-only format. So thank you very much, Cake Smoke. That's what we're aiming for.
Do you think that review is specific to listening in a car? Are radiology podcasts listenable in other contexts?
No, only in cars.
Only in cars.
I don't know. Another one, this is from Zach, a radiology registrar in Brisbane. Just wanted to share that my girlfriend, who is not radiology at all, she's an ENT resident, has taken to listening to your podcast even without me. She really enjoys the comedic stylings of Andrew and the interplay with Frank, who she thinks is the perfect straight man of the comedy duo. You're the straight man, Gaillard.
Mm-hmm.
Zach's wife, she can be the official Brisbane Zach's wife of the podcast.
Do you know, I got my mum to listen to the podcast. Well, I told my mum that we had started a podcast.
Mum, I'm on a podcast. Please listen.
And she's forever supportive and amazing. And so she said, "Oh, I want to listen to it." So she did. Yeah. And I was talking to her about it, and she said, "Oh, it's very good. It's clearly good cop, bad cop." And I looked at her and said, "What? Who's good cop?" And she looked at me like I was a complete and utter idiot. And she said, "Of course, Andrew's the good cop."
I think maybe I am the bad cop, but you're the naughty criminal that I'm interrogating each week.
So do you think my mum can be the official mother of the podcast?
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Why not? Has your mother listened?
No, I don't think so. I can ask her. I don't think it's going to be her cup of tea, though. reading out this feedback and reviews makes me think of a little thing that my daughter said to me the other day in the car. She said, "Dad, words can't describe how beautiful you are." I was like, "Oh, that's lovely." And then she said, "But numbers can. 2 out of 10."
Wow,
So,
she is going to be so much trouble.
that was great. We've got questions as well, Gaylord. You've got time for some questions. So
Yep, okay.
this one from Michael. He said, "If you could eliminate one part of your day-to-day work as a radiologist, what would you choose?"
You mean aside from all the work stuff that happens between arriving and going home? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
If only part of that, protocoling MRIs. I don't know how it works at your hospital, but at Royal Melbourne, we have this strangely paternalistic view of protocoling MRIs where it's really complicated and only radiologists and trainees can do it because you have to get the right protocol out of, I don't know how many we have, like 200, 500. We have a lot, one for each possible condition. And I don't know, like MR, other than increasing your recall rate a bit, sprinkle some sequences that most of the time you'll get the answer. And the tediousness of going through that is just awful.
At the Alfred, we protocol all of the inpatient and emergency requests, but all of the outpatient MRI requests get protocoled by the radiographers, and only ones where they have a question do they flag it with us.
Yes.
And often the question will be related to billings, or am I doing it more targeted at this or targeted at that? But yeah, the vast majority of outpatient MRI studies are radiographer protocoled, and they do a far better job than I could do with the vast majority of them.
Right, and the vast majority of them, there's no subtlety or clinical judgment
routine.
required. It's follow-up of a glioma.
Correct. Another question is, in response to last week's episode, Frank, we have a question. Have you got a favorite productivity hack?
So there's one that is easier to do at home for me anyway than at work, and that is compartmentalizing your physical environment to particular tasks. So at home, I've got an office, which is where I am now, and the only thing I do in my office is work. So the moment I come into this room, I don't have any computer games on my computer. There's a guitar in the background, but realistically, that's mostly a prop these days. And that's all that I do. I come in here. And so the moment I step into this room, I'm in a work frame of mind. At work, it's much harder because my office, I do some reporting in my office, but also do admin, and I also muck around for 10 minutes having a coffee, watching YouTube clips. Or when reporting in the reporting room, similarly, you are sometimes reporting, you're sometimes checking your email, you're sometimes talking to people. And so it's much harder to enter that one task frame of mind. And I would love to, at work, to really stop doing anything other than reporting in the reading room and get up and go to my office to do everything else. But I share my office, so that's no longer possible, unfortunately. What about you? Do you have one?
Just to summarize, your hack is to own a mansion and have one separate room for every little task that you perform.
Every activity should have one different room.
And a butler in each. My productivity hack is not really a productivity hack that's particularly relatable to most people, but it's to have people like Juliet and Murph running things in the background.
So they're amazing. Yes.
Two people who work for us at Radiopedia and take care of a whole lot of things. Murph will be dealing with some of this podcast. Hi, Murph. How you doing? Good luck with the edit. So, yeah, that's my hack. Get people to help you.
Yeah.
Well, it's time to finish off with our favourite segment, Gaillard, called What You Up To?
What am I up to? All right.
Yeah, what are you up to?
The past few weeks and the next couple of weeks are very heavily centered around onboarding a couple of new developers for Radiopedia. We've had some staffing changes, and we've got 2 new developers starting up, which is great. But it always takes an inordinate amount of time, not just to get set up, but the code base of Radiopedia, some parts of it date back over 10 years, 15 years. And it's a complicated code base. And before a new developer can meaningfully contribute to sizable feature stories rather than just little tweaks here and there, they really need to not just understand the code, but they also need to understand how the website is meant to work from a user point of view. And that takes hours and hours and weeks and really probably months before that's the case. And you can short circuit that a lot by sitting with them and showing them, how does an editor use the site? How does a contributor use the site? What is this thing we call a radiology case? Because a lot of them have never seen anything except an upside down X-ray on a TV show. So that's what I'm up to. What about you?
I recorded my talk for the ASNR, so the American Society of Neuroradiology conference, recorded that last week. So I've been working on that. I've got multiple talks to record for our conference, Radiopedia 2023, which is coming up in July. People should register.
Yes.
But I feel like I need to tell my Sydney story.
Oh, you have a Sydney story?
Have we got time?
Okay.
Yeah. So this is what I've been up to in the last few weeks. So, and when I told the wife of the podcast, when I told her that I might tell the Sydney story on the podcast, she said, "Oh, that's not very relatable." And then when I thought about it, I thought, well, it's only not relatable because of what she did, not because of what I did. So I'm going to tell it.
All right, go.
We go to Sydney for the weekend. Kids are back home in Melbourne. We don't get away from the kids very often, so it's a bit of a party vibe already. And Belinda likes to pack things in. She likes to have a very organised schedule while we're away. So she organises us to go to the opera, and the opera is on Sydney Harbour. It's not in the Opera House. This is like one of the ones that's outdoors. So you've got a view of the Opera House. You've got a view of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Beautiful. It's a warm day, humid, as Sydney often is.
What opera was it? The official mother of the podcast will want to know, since that's her area.
Madame Butterfly, and she's going to love that. So it's going to be one of her favourites.
Yep.
So Madame Butterfly on the water in Sydney, nice warm day. So I'm like, oh, okay, right. It's hot. I'm wearing a t-shirt, right? It's outdoors. It can't be too formal, right? So we get there a little bit early. We're lining up, and I'm looking, and there's a few people fairly casually dressed, but the majority are pretty well dressed, right? There's a lot of black ties hanging around.
Oh, really?
And then my wife goes, "Oh, it's actually opening night. I forgot to tell you it's opening night." Oh, okay. And I look at my wife, and she's dressed up beautifully as well. And so I'm like, oh, I'm feeling a bit odd in my t-shirt. You get there a couple of hours early because they have all these food trucks set up, so you can get dinner first and then sit down and watch the opera. And then my wife's like, "Oh, I thought it would be really busy, so instead of going to the food trucks, I actually booked us in to a set dinner." I was like, "Oh, cool, all right." So we walk in, total opposite direction to the majority of people. In fact, where we're walking in, looks like the black tie people. And so we get to this door and it says Platinum Club or something. And I'm like, oh, that seems odd. I'm sure this isn't the right place. Anyway, our name's on the list. So we go in. It's very exclusive. There's literally like 20 or 30 people in this place. Opening night, black tie. I'm wearing a t-shirt. We sit down, have an amazing 3-course meal, all the drinks that you could possibly want. Everything's all taken care of. I don't know what my wife paid, but it was probably too much. And then someone walks past me, and it's former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. He walks past.
There you go. Right? Was he wearing a t-shirt?
No, he was black tie, that guy. Speedos below, but black tie top. And then a few minutes later, Scott Morrison, another former Prime Minister of Australia, walks past. And then a few minutes later, another Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, walks past, not sitting with the other two. They're slightly differently aligned within, even though they're within the same political party. So there I am with, in a room, only 30 or so people wearing a t-shirt with 3 former Prime Ministers. And for those listening overseas, this is the equivalent to the president in the United States. So I've got 3 Prime Ministers in the room. There I am in a t-shirt. And so when the performance starts, they actually they ring the bell. Everyone's sitting there in the stands ready for the opera, but not us. We come in as dignitaries at the last minute. So we get paraded out with these former Prime Ministers. I'm literally right behind, Scott Morrison. And then someone in the crowd sees him and starts booing. and then, my wife and I have had a few drinks by this stage. And my wife goes, "Yeah, boo." Does a bit of a boo as well. And then anyway, we sit down, we watch the opera, we go back in at the intermission back into this room, even though I don't think we were technically supposed to go back in there. So we have more drinks with these fancy people. But my favorite part of this story, and this just shows how organized my wife is. So at the end, you're out on this point. It's quite isolated in Sydney, and everyone needs to get back home at the end, right? And so there's all this. It's really hard to get transport.
Yeah.
Opera Australia books all these water taxis, so
Yep.
people can get a water taxi. But there's a massive queue for these water taxis. So these people dressed up to the nines waiting for their water taxis. And my wife's like, "Oh, I actually booked us our own private charter." and she calls up this guy and he says, "Oh yeah, just when you get to the top of the stairs, wave," right? And I'm like, "Oh, we can't really cut in front of all these people." So I get to the top of the stairs and I wave, and this boat just sweeps in. It's twice the size of any of the water taxis. It just sweeps in, does a little, and then we just cut past all these people. My wife's like, "Oh, that's our boat there. Sorry, that's our boat there." We jump on this boat and it's just the two of us in the back of this fancy boat.
What do you mean? There weren't any ex-prime ministers with you?
Nah, it was just our boat on our own, and we just cruise off into the night, get some photos in front of the Opera House. It was amazing. How relatable is that, though?
I can't believe you just gave me grief about having a study at home.
You know what this is, though? This is what happens when you spend 6 months, 12 months at home with the kids, don't go away on holidays at all. And so when you do get a weekend away, we were there for a friend's 40th birthday. When you do get away, you just pack things up and you live it up. And but 3 former prime ministers in one night.
So the other thing that's struck me as interesting was if I was put in that situation, I think there's a reasonable chance that I wouldn't recognize any of the 3. Because as you were mentioning their names, like I recognize their names, but I'm struggling to picture them given my self-imposed news isolation.
Well, that's good. Their images are burnt into my retina.
And I would have thought they were booing me.
So there you go. That's my Sydney story. So we'll finish off. How can people get in contact with us, Frank?
Well, we are at Radiopedia on Twitter and Instagram, as well as at Frank Gaillard and at Dr. Andrew Dixon. And you can email us at podcast@radiopedia.org with any ideas and feedback, particularly on our cognitive bias segments and any questions you might have for the next Hostful.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget that if you want to support Radiopedia, then you can become a paid supporter via the website or purchase an all-access pass to our online courses and our upcoming July Radiopedia 2023 conference.
Oh, plenty of great lectures coming in from our speakers for that at the moment. Yeah. So it's going to be amazing. So if you haven't registered yet, hop to it.
And the thing to also remember there is that you're not only registering for yourself, but for those of you who are in high income regions, the registration allows us to make it free to everyone in low and middle income countries. And that's over half of all countries, 125.
And what else can people do to help out, Frank?
And of course, you can also help out by leaving a 5-star review in the podcast app of your choosing.
That's the end of the Hostful. Was it good for you, Frank?
It was very good.
It was very good. Big episode next week, actually. I've got a readful episode with a superstar radiologist. So it was really fun to record. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing that with everyone. So let's get out of here. I'll read my little my little outro thing. What do I say? And we'll catch you all again sometime soon in the reading room. Over to you, Frank.
Stay rad, everyone. Stay rad.
Not bad. You're maintaining it. See you, Frank. See you next week.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye.